All right, let's talk about a book that really shook things up. We're going all the way back to 1976, to this little 60-page booklet that totally upended the world of Dungeons & Dragons. This is the story of Eldritch Wizardry, the one that brought cosmic horror, psychic warfare, and a whole lot of controversy to the table. So to get why this book was such a big deal, you gotta put yourself back in 76. D&D had been out for a few years, and players were getting, well, they were getting really good, you know? They knew all the monsters, they had the rules down pat, and they were just steamrolling dungeons. That sense of mystery was starting to go away, and you could feel the complacency setting in. And this quote says it all, right from the man himself, Gary Gygax. He saw it. The real sense of danger, it was just fading away from his own game. The players had cracked the code. So, how do you possibly surprise heroes who've seen everything you can throw at them? Gygax and his team at TSR came up with a pretty radical solution. I mean, they didn't just add tougher monsters. No, they injected a dose of pure, chaotic, kind of Lovecraftian horror right into the game's DNA. And it was a move that wouldn't just challenge the players. Oh no, it would soon attract a very different and very, very unwelcome kind of attention. So let's crack this thing open and see what really made it tick. To really get it, you have to understand where it came from, and more importantly, how it was slapped together. So, Eldritch Wizardry was the third and final big rules expansion for the original white box D&D set. It dropped just a few months after the last one, Blackmoor, and it really represents the last big, chaotic burst of creativity before TSR started nailing everything down for the much more structured Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And you might be wondering, how did they churn this out so fast? Well, they used what's called a diverse hands approach. So while Gygax and his partner Brian Bloom got their names on the cover, the book was really this mashup of ideas. Some of its most famous and, yeah, infamous editions actually came from outside contributors, guys like Dennis Suster and Steve Marsh. Now we have to talk about the book's most immediate controversy. This was the very first D&D supplement to have a full-color cover, and boy did they make a choice. The artist, Deborah Larson, painted a scene with a nude woman on a sacrificial altar. The editor, Tim Kask, later said they knew it was provocative, they debated it, but they just ran with it. Back then, the audience was mostly adult gamers, so it wasn't a huge crisis. But that image would come back to haunt them. Okay, let's move past the cover and see what this book actually added for the players. Because Eldritch Wizardry wasn't just about new monsters. It gave players some absolutely wild new toys to play with. First up, the druid. Before this, they were just monsters you could fight, but Dennis Suster turned them into a full-on character class. And this wasn't just a cleric who liked trees, you know? It was a dedicated, truly neutral protector of nature. They had some serious restrictions, like they could only wear leather armor, but the trade-off was these incredible new abilities, like walking through dense forests and, of course, the iconic shape-changing. And this right here shows just how different the class was. It had this super rigid competitive hierarchy. You couldn't just grind out enough experience points to become the great druid. Nope, there was only one in the entire game world, and if you wanted that title, you had to find the person who held it and defeat them in a duel. It was a whole end game built right into the class design. Just brilliant. And then there was psionics. This was probably the most radical idea in the entire book. Any human character had this tiny chance of just being psychic. And it had nothing to do with the normal fire and forget magic system that wizards used. This was something totally new, using a pool of psionic strength points and playing by a completely different set of rules. And the rules were a lot. Psychic combat was basically a whole separate game inside the game. You had to pick specific attack modes to go after an opponent's mind, and then you had to pick defense modes to protect your own, and you were cross-referencing everything on this complex chart. You could literally be in a mental battle to the death while a sword fight is happening all around you. So, what did players think of this revolutionary new psychic system? Well, they hated it, pretty much across the board. It was clunky, it was way too complicated, and honestly, it just didn't feel like it belonged in a fantasy game. Psionics quickly became the system that most dungeon masters just banned from their tables. A really fascinating idea, but way too messy in practice. But hey, if psionics was the book's biggest mechanical failure, its greatest thematic success was the introduction of something truly, truly terrifying. This is the moment D&D stopped being just about goblins and dragons and started being about cosmic, unknowable evil. Gygax didn't just throw in a couple of demons. No, He created this clinical, almost scientific classification of evil. He sorted them by type, and each one was more horrifying than the last. And sitting at the very top of this nightmare food chain, he gave us two of the most iconic villains in D&D history. Orcus, the Lord of the Undead, and the dual-headed Demogorgon, Prince of Demons. Now, here's a fantastic bit of gaming history for you. That iconic Type V demon, you know the one, the big fiery monster with a whip, in the very first printing of Eldritch Wizardry, it wasn't called a Type V. It was called a Balrog, a direct lift right out of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Yeah, as you can probably guess, the Tolkien estate was not exactly amused. A legal notice came down and forced TSR to scramble. They had to hastily change the name to the generic Type 6 demon in all the later printings. Of course, that creature would eventually get a new name, the Baelor, but its origins are pure Middle-earth. So to fight these new cosmic-level threats, players were going to need some cosmic-level power. And Eldritch Wizardry delivered with what might just be the most exciting part of the entire book: artifacts and relics. These weren't just super powerful magic items. They were legendary objects with incredible backstories, and they were filled with inside jokes. The Lich God Vecna was an anagram for the fantasy author Jack Vance. The Sword of Cass was named for the editor Tim Kask. The Rod of Gax? Come on, for Geekax himself. He even named powerful items after his own kids. This was the creators literally embedding themselves into the deepest lore of their own game. And this is the absolute genius of the system. An artifact's powers weren't set in stone. The dungeon master would secretly roll on these tables to figure out what it could do. But, and this is a huge but, for every chance you had at a godlike prime power, like casting a wish, there was an equal chance of triggering a malevolent effect, like getting cursed or straight up possessed by a demon. Wielding an artifact was the ultimate roll of the dice. So, what happens when you put all of this together? You get a wildly ambitious, mechanically messy, and thematically terrifying book. Let's take a quick look at the long-term impact of Eldritch Wizardry. You know, the book's legacy has always been split right down the middle. Players absolutely adored the atmosphere. They loved the druid, they loved the demons, and they loved that feeling that the world was genuinely dangerous again. But they despised the mechanical bloat, the psionics, the super detailed combat rules. Everyone felt like it just slowed the game to a crawl. And remember that cover? Well, as D&D just exploded in popularity and started reaching younger kids, the critics who were looking for a reason to condemn the game, they found their smoking gun right here. That art, combined with the detailed descriptions of demons and sacrificial magic, became Exhibit A in the whole satanic panic that would plague the hobby for the next decade. Which really brings us to the final question. Look, Eldritch Wizardry was deeply flawed. It was mechanically overstuffed, it was culturally explosive, but it was also undeniably visionary. It burned away the last little bits of D&D's simple wargaming origins and forged a multiverse that was darker, weirder, and infinitely more exciting. So, was this messy, brilliant book the chaotic spark the game needed to become the legend it is today? That's something worth thinking about.